For an introduction to how development is controlled in Tasmania, you cannot go past the Environmental Law Handbook, which is put out by the Environmental Defender's Office. It is a lay introduction to how development is controlled and decisions are made in Tasmania. And yeah, it's just fantastic. So if you're coming in quite raw in terms of environmental impact assessment, read this chapter. So because it's so important, I've decided that it's worth me going through it in a little bit of detail, at least to point out the parts of the chapter that you should probably read at least a couple of times. It starts with talking about the two acts that regulate this. And I know this all sounds quite legalistic, but to me as a biologist and a practitioner, this was a real revelation as to why some funny things were happening that didn't kind of make a lot of sense, and why some things were taken into account and other things weren't. Why weeds and threatened species were important, but a good habitat, say a good heathland that wasn't a listed community, it didn't matter. So this does make sense once you persist with understanding these controls, and these are the legal controls on development. So the approval process is governed by Land Use Planning and Approvals Act, LUPA, and that will roll off your tongue shortly. And this is the kind of overarching legislation that regulates planning. So when you want to do something, you want to put a house on a bush block, LUPA guides you as to what you can and can't do. The other really important act in terms of environmental impact assessment is EMCA, Environmental Management and Pollution Control Act. And so you'll get to be quite familiar, not so much with LUPA, but with EMCA, and particularly the way that EMCA has a hierarchy of different types of development and how the processes control that. So a whole lot of things will make sense once you start kind of understanding these basics. And all of environmental impact assessment, all is initiated with somebody coming up with a brilliant idea, whether it's a cable car at Mount Wellington or whether it's putting a house on a bush block somewhere in suburban Launceston or Hobart. You need planning approval. And so this is all part of this public agreement that we have as part of sustainable development, or development in general, if you want to drop the word sustainable, to say, okay, this is what I want to do. Is this okay? And this is a public process so that we can have input, and that, you know, as a democracy, we can regulate development control and not stop development, but do it in a way that we agree as a democratic society is an okay way forward. Not necessarily everybody will be happy about everything all the time, but it works. If it's applied well, and people are well informed and operate in good faith, it can work. It does work really well most of the time, but yeah, we'll go into the details. So you need planning approval if you're going to change the land, put in any kind of new development. This could be a pulp mill, this could be a fairly modest building, or expand existing development. And so you need to approach either an expert planner or council and say, this is what I'm thinking of doing. Do I need a permit? So you might require a permit if you're intensifying the use of the land. So if you're out at the pulp mill near New Norfolk and you want to put in a new piece of equipment, you need to see whether you need to get approval for that. So there's quite a lot of detail on this page in terms of page numbers, but persist. So don't worry about some of the details here. I do need you to know that EMCA and LUPA are important, and that local councils are important. So how do you go about getting planning approval and engaging in this public process? You go to your local council. So it doesn't matter whether you want to erect a garden shed, build a factory, subdivide a rural block, you need to go to the council and talk to the planner and figure out what the planning scheme does and doesn't allow you to do. You need to apply, so you need to get a bunch of paperwork together, and the way that that is guided is through Land Use Planning Approvals Act, LUPA, and the planning scheme. And the planning scheme sets out what information is required and how that process happens. So one of the things that you will hear is this reference to the clock, and that the clock is ticking, and when the clock starts and stops, this is all part of our contract as a society, that this is how the process will run, and we won't give people uncertain time frames. So a developer, somebody proposing something, will have set time frames. Similarly, the public will have an opportunity over a couple of weeks to have a say about something. So it's not open-ended, and this is all part of fairness and natural justice. And so there's a whole lot of legal principles that underpin the way that this is done. We have mentioned the Resource Management Planning Appeal Tribunal, which I pronounce as RMPAT. You might hear it as a slightly different way. And again, they're, along with the council, they're an important body, because if you're upset about something, whether you're the developer or whether you're a neighbour, there are processes. So it's not just a process, a decision's made all over. In most circumstances, you can say, I'm really unhappy about this, and take it to the tribunal. The EPA is an important body as well, and particularly when it's a larger development or particular types of potentially polluting developments, the EPA gets involved in saying whether the development is okay. So, approvals process. I wouldn't worry too much about state policies. In short, state policies haven't worked all that well. There's state policies on coastal areas and a couple of other things. I think it's too much detail for you to worry about at the moment. Planning schemes is the key instrument that you need to be worried about at the moment. So you do need to comply with the planning scheme, and this is where planners have a bit of a tricky role, because they frequently get people upset about them, about decisions and what's allowed and what's not allowed, and this is because they're bound by planning schemes and what can and can't be considered. As we go through the examples, some of this will become clear. Okay, so this is another point that we don't need to labour, but just to get around the general principle of, as a society, what we decide is okay and not okay. So some things we have decided through these legal instruments that it's okay, so long as your garden shed fits in a 3 metre by 3 metre footprint, you generally it's a permitted use, and you don't need to go through lots of hoops. So we have decided that some things can be permitted, and this is all changing under the current Tasmanian planning scheme changes. Then at the other end of the scale, there's a whole lot of things that are rejected, whether it's because you can't put a childcare centre in an area that has industrial use, whatever it is, there's common sense reasons why that use is just not okay. And then in the middle, you have what's called discretionary use, where it's a little bit more in a grey area, and we engage in a dialogue, public, the person who came up with the idea, the environmental professionals who are providing advice, and an outcome is negotiated. And so this might be a, yes, you can build your house, but you have to satisfy these couple of conditions. You can't be in the corner where there's the good heathland, etc. Or it might be rejected, and if it is rejected, there has to be reasons why, because there has to be natural justice here. I wouldn't worry too much about this part. This is just elaborating on those different categories, something that's prohibited, permitted, discretionary. Some of this you can come back to later in the semester, and it will make a little bit more sense. this point 1 is good here because council need to advertise the development, and so this is an important part of environmental impact assessment, is that people need to have their say, whether they're neighbours or concerned individuals, be it something in, say, Wellington Forest. It's probably a bad example because that's forestry and that process is not functioning very well. But council need to let people know so that people can think about it and have their say. Council take that say in terms of what's called representations, and so you're given a certain amount of time to have your say, and that will then be taken into account. You often need to put in that initial letter just to stay in the process, in the loop. So even if it's perhaps something that's quite brief, it is important to be part of the process and have your say. Don't worry about referring applications to around water or sewage. The EPA is a bit more important, much more important in terms of environmental impact assessment, because this is where the potential for environmental harm is managed and why we have resources from the EPA in this unit, because this is kind of the guts of environmental impact assessment. So I think you can skip through some of this. We're not going to get into building or water sewage control. Some of this is a little bit outdated. You'll notice the date here is 2015. I think this older version is actually a little clearer and has more text than the new version, and that's why I'm using this one. But I mean, the new version is still something that's good to read. I wouldn't worry about some of this detail. Okay, environmental impact assessment, environmental controls, IMCA. So you should have a little bit of fluency, at least by halfway through the unit, once you've looked at a couple of different case studies about the levels of activities under MCA in the legislation, and that starts with level 1, so low impact activities, and local councils regulate this. Sometimes the EPA might get involved, that the director might call it in, is the way it's referred to, but generally a lot of applications don't require any more than council scrutiny. Level 2 is a whole different matter. So level 2 are things that are listed in a schedule in MCA, and it lists things like quarries and meat works and wood processing facilities, and they're managed through the EPA, so a different set of controls. I'm not sure why that hasn't printed all that well. Keep moving. So this is where we are a little bit more concerned as a society about environmental harm, about thinking carefully about the way that the environment and the proposed development interact to harm the environment, and getting expert input to make decisions about whether that's okay or not. Is the potential environmental harm okay? And if it needs to be changed, how does it need to be changed? So what conditions might you need to put in? So there's some practical advice here about planning in advance, about needing to go and talk to the council very early in the planning process, and also talk to a consultant. So we're putting you in the shoes of a consultant for part of the unit, and this helps you get a sense of where environmental impact assessment can work really well, where somebody with an idea, like a cable car, talks to consultants and talks to council and figures out where might be the main sticking points, so that really early on, before there's a lot of investment in design and in studies, the kind of general scope of that and the special advice is taken into account. So here's a little bit more about what the legislation requires you to do. An important part of natural justice and part of the environmental impact assessment process is providing adequate information. You don't need to know all the details. We're not training you to be expert planners. You are the environmental consultants who come in and give advice to the planning authority and to planning consultants. So that might mean, for your part, providing a flora and fauna survey, providing Aboriginal heritage advice, for surveying students, providing that expert input. So this takes the form of getting a permit and writing an environmental management plan. So you might hear this referred to as a DPEMP, and again, like Blueprint NCAT, this will eventually run off your tongue. So for level 2 activities, there needs to be some kind of report written. Don't worry too much about what that's called, but this is where the environmental impact assessment comes in and your expert advice comes in. And the EPA requires, and Council requires, these expert reports. In Tasmania, environmental impact assessments are required for those more impactful developments that are either listed as Schedule 2 activities in the legislation or level 3 that we'll get to in a minute. Don't worry about some of these. Environmental agreements we'll mention much later. Public hearings, just to emphasise that the public say is important. It doesn't always function very well, and the forestry sector is a good example of this, both here and in other states of Australia. But in general, this does work well as long as you're keeping an eye on the time frame. Some of this has changed thanks to the current government, so don't worry too much about this. There is some good information here about environmental impact assessment and what needs to happen. There needs to be an assessment of the likely environmental impacts. There needs to be identification of conditions or restrictions. So yes, you can build this house, but no, you can't build it on top of the chocolate lilies, for example. And the regulators will tell you what needs to happen. And it depends on what level of assessment is required as to exactly what kind of reporting. And so a lot of this is common sense. There's not going to need to be a massive amount of information if the site is fairly trashed and the development is pretty modest. And so when you get up to something like a pulp mill, then you're talking about a level 3 development where a massive integrated assessment that costs the proponent or the person who proposes the project a huge amount of time and money. These in Tasmania, these are called projects of state significance, POS. Sorry to just introduce another acronym. And these are level 3 developments. You can call them level 3, but under legislation they're called projects of state significance. Who conducts the environmental impact assessment? Good question, because a lot of people who take this class are interested in that kind of specialist knowledge, and whether your disciplinary background is flora or fauna or surveying or geology or heritage, this is where you get involved. So this will become a little bit clearer as you do some of the case study work, but there is detail in this level 2 about exactly how much harm is likely, whether it's 2A, 2B, 2C. You don't need to worry about that for now. And that dictates the kind of reporting. So it's fairly simple in terms of, the larger the development and the more potential for impact, the more information is required as part of the decision-making process. And this is all allowed for under the legislation. The public has to have a say, the EPA needs to be satisfied, and if things don't go ahead, then that all needs to be very carefully documented so that the proponent understands, and if they're not happy, they can appeal. You'll get some more information on this as the semester progresses, but this really is the guts of environmental impact assessment. Environmental surveys, professional information that goes into an environmental management plan. It needs to describe the existing environment, describe what kind of development, identify the potential impacts, and suggest ways in which maybe they can be avoided. So in terms of, for example, cabin development that's proposed for Geilston Bay, you need to say what's proposed, you need to say where it's being proposed, what kind of environment it's going into, through using things like Land System Information Tasmania and the Natural Values Atlas. And you need to make sense of those two things using a bit of common sense, potentially using some of your specialist background, but we're not presuming that you have that specialist expertise already. So don't worry too much about some of these details. And some of this is written for people who are not professionals, who are lay people, who are concerned about a development and trying to inform themselves and trying to get access to the information. So again, we've mentioned the clock. This is the clock here, and the amount of time increases with a larger, more complicated development. So the public have longer to comment the larger the development. So planning, approval, of council manages all of this. The EPA may or may not be involved depending on how big the project is. This is what you just need to get through this section. We don't expect that there is no exam in this unit. You don't need to regurgitate all of this, but by the time you're into, say, week 8 or 9 of the unit, you will understand this because you will have been through this, through a couple of case studies. Appeals, warning, appealing, you can appeal under certain circumstances. And again, you don't need to know the details of this, but just to understand that there is natural justice here for all the parties that are involved, whether you're the developer, whether you're a utility, whether you're the council, whether you're a person who made a representation to council. So this is all part of our society allowing people to have a say. You may not get the outcome that you want, but you are allowed to have your say. So this is more detail about the tribunal. You don't need to, this is not printed very well. You don't need to know this detail. And then at the back end of the chapter are some more controls, and we will go into this in the second half of the semester. So I know that this is a lot of content all in one, but this chapter is really worth getting to know over the course of the semester. We will do some auditing later in semester. We'll talk a little bit about improvement programs, partly through some local case studies like Nearstar have multiple improvement programs. This is a local highly polluting company that are going on. So yeah, the very back part of this chapter is about having your say, informing yourself. This unit was set up by somebody who was looking to inform environmental professionals, but also running it as an important part of informing citizens about the way that development is regulated so that they could have their say. So this part about representations and appeal periods is important. Some of this is too much detail. Projects of regional significance have never been used in Tasmania. The legislation is going through an overhaul at the moment. Projects of state significance have been used 5-6 times. Pulp mill, Basslink, a few that haven't gone ahead. So I'm sorry, I hope this isn't making you motion sick, because I don't think that you need to worry about some of this back half of the chapter. Pores have never been used in Tasmania. There may be a similar process coming up soon. Regional, well, there is being considered, so we'll talk about that later. We don't need to worry about it now. This is the level 3. Here's a couple of examples. Lauderdale Quay, Basslink, Ocean Port didn't go ahead. And a little bit about the assessment process. So again, we're not expecting you to know the details, but to understand that there's 3 different levels of assessment that relate to different size activities. Major infrastructure is important. You don't need to worry about it now, but this is what has been used instead of the regional development process. So things like big electricity lines that go across multiple local government areas, they've used the different approval process. So I hope that's helped. I know this has ended up being a bit of a spiel, but it is important just to get you a sense of what you do and don't need to know. But this chapter, even though it contains a lot of detail, it is really useful and it's something that you will come back to. So I'll end on this note, putting the relevant legislation up there. The second and third are the main ones to take notice of: the Land Use Planning Approvals Act, or LUPA, and Environmental Management and Pollution Control Act, or EMPA. So I hope this helps, and yeah, please let me know if you want any elaboration, because it's really easy for me to do.